in the cases of autism, roughly 1 in 5 mothers of children with autism have been investigated by social services, and I've seen it that reported that roughly 1 in 6 have had their children even removed into foster care or placed into adoption. Fiona, I'd like you to comment on that and perhaps also tell our audience what is fabricated illness or perplexing presentations, and explain it in the best way possible.
Okay, I think I'll start with that in terms of what is fabricated and induced illness and perplexing presentations. So you would think that with the name being fabricated and induced illness, it means illnesses that are made up or caused, created, induced in the child. And that is effectively what Munchausen syndrome by proxy was. It was a parent who made their child ill on purpose or lied and pretended that their child was ill in order to get a reaction. But actually, fabricated and induced illness, as it's defined by the Royal College of Child Paediatrics and Paediatrics Child Health, is actually much broader than that, and they admit that. So they've gone beyond that, and they say, actually, we can include parents who have no intention to deceive at all. We will include parents who are just worried about their child and behaving anxiously. It doesn't matter what the motivation of the parent is. They don't have to be inducing it. They don't have to be intentionally fabricating it. They might be erroneously reporting without even realizing. And all of that is included as FII and treated as if it's equally as abhorrent as actually inducing illness in a child. Perplexing presentations is something that's also been created by the RCPCH. And it is a term that it talks about situations where nobody's really quite sure what's going on. So it's complicated presentations, basically, that nobody's got to the bottom of. But it's presented by the RCPCH effectively as if, as medics, there is an answer, and if they can't find the answer, then whatever's left is non-existent. It's psychosomatic. It's been made up. So the assumption is you can explain it all, and if you can't explain it all and we don't find a cause, then everything else is being invented, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And that's effectively the premise of what's going on, and that's why this is such a huge problem, because it's lumping together firstly the assumption that the medics know everything. When you're talking about general practitioners and paediatricians who know a little about a lot because they're generalists, then they don't know everything. And it's lumping, so it's assuming that in the start, but it's also including parents who are just worried about their child and don't know what's going on and are asking lots of questions, and having health professionals saying, well, we can't see anything wrong, therefore you're making it up. It's a very bizarre logic, and it doesn't make sense. It's not logical.
Is it the parental behaviour or motivation, or must the definition include the idea that the child must have suffered harm as a result, significant harm as a result?
Really good question, because Munchausen syndrome by proxy effectively evolved into a condition that's now called factitious disorder imposed on another in the psychiatric manuals, and that is a psychiatric condition, and it requires that the parent is intentionally deceiving, knows what they're doing, and that parent's behavior can't be explained by something else. So if they're anxious, or if they have some other condition that explains why they're behaving in that particular way, then it's not FDIOA, it's not factitious disorder, it's something else, and it wouldn't get diagnosed. But FII is not a psychiatric condition. It's not even a diagnosis. It's referred to by the RCPCH as a pediatric diagnosis, but it isn't. It doesn't exist in a diagnostic manual. And they use it as if it's a thing, but it isn't a thing. So that's one of the things one of the areas that's quite frustrating. They're very clear in their guidance that parental motivation is, from their perspective, irrelevant, because what matters from the perspective of FII is if the child is harmed. But what then gets tricky is the definition of harm, because the RCPCH will define harm effectively as a child who's taken for lots of medical investigations or taken to the doctor more times than other people think is appropriate, or is taken out of school and other people don't think that they should have been. That's all being interpreted as harm, but there's no evidence that that's harm. So the situation that Ellie was describing, where you have the school saying, well, we don't think there's a problem, and everything's being experienced at home, very quickly gets interpreted as parental harm and abuse of the child, because the school or other professionals are just simply not seeing the behaviours.
I mean, I suppose a child might be presenting in a particular way, and the mum or father might be just overly anxious to try and find out, what is wrong. I mean, in what way does an anxious parent abuse a child?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think you also have to think about what's the definition of overly anxious. So at what point is someone being inappropriately anxious? Any parent who's worried about their child wants to know what's wrong with their child and is going to have a level of concern and anxiety about that. But I think what's challenging is when people start to say that parents are overly anxious. What they actually mean is, we don't think that there's a problem, and this mum keeps telling us that there is, and we would really rather hope they go away and just take our word for it, because we don't accept that there's anything wrong, or we haven't found anything that's wrong. And in situations like Ellie described, where you're not even getting referred to the specialist who could actually be the person who answers that question, then that's really tricky. And I think most sensible parents, if they have the courage to do so, actually would be challenging or going and finding alternative professionals, or saying, well, I'm not getting very far, I'm still worried about my child, I'll go and find a specialist. But that's also seen as a flag for possibly making it up, because you've gone to find somebody else, you haven't accepted what that professional has said. So the whole situation is almost geared around, it has a little bit of a feel of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest about it, in that once you've stepped onto that pathway and somebody starts to view you potentially as making stuff up or not accepting the professional opinion, then that doesn't go away, and it skews the way that that's looked at. And you might even be at risk of having less opportunity of being referred to the specialist who needs to see you, because the people that you're interacting with have become so certain in their own minds that there's nothing going on, and that you're just some kind of deluded individual.
But the interpretation, the definition of the condition itself is critically important, isn't it? Because otherwise you're going to have sort of a wide, broad interpretation placed by child protection agencies, which then could invoke court proceedings, for example, unnecessarily and improperly, and without evidence.
Exactly, and unfortunately that's what's happened. And added to that, there are comments in the RCPCH guidelines that specifically say things like examples of the kind of conditions that might be fabricated are autism or neurodevelopmental presentations, which might be a parent who's struggling to manage their child. Or they say, you might have an autistic mother who is overly anxious and uncertain about parenting, and that might therefore also be FII. So they're actually stating conditions as being indicators and associated with FII, without any evidence to support that whatsoever.
I think that's probably good point to bring in Andy, because Andy, what are the alert signs? I mean, in accordance with the guidance, the alert signs, what advice is given to practitioners to look out for when they are confronting a parent and a child in this kind of situation?
Okay, I mean, I think the first thing is that there are only alerting signs, that there's no actual process for diagnosis. This is not a very well evidenced or evidenced at all entity. In fact, when we started looking at this, what you would expect with a disease or so on, it would be that there would be an evidence base on which it was based. So you would expect epidemiological evidence. How often is this occurring? Where is it recurring? There's only some very limited evidence. It's very flawed, and it was done years and years ago on a very flawed basis. There's nothing on the accuracy and precision of diagnostic tests. Nobody's done research on it. So they brought out a completely new set of what they call alerting signs. And remember, this is effectively what we're talking about here is profiling. We're not talking about diagnosis, we're talking about profiling. So we're looking at diagnosis by profiling somebody. They fit into these categories. Now, the categories are very broad, but they revolve around basically a problem between diagnosis and a belief about what should happen because of a diagnosis or lack of diagnosis, and what's being seen. So you get the first one: reported physical, psychological, or behavioural symptoms and signs not observed independently in their reported context. Now, that sounds like, yes, it'd be very easy to think about that, but you've just heard about a problem where the presentation was a lot more at home than it was at school. So there's a real issue about that. One of the ways that they've tried to get around this is to bring people into hospital and observe them. But observations, even in hospital conditions, are not perfect. They miss things that are infrequent. They miss things which happen because of context.
They're very artificial, Andy, aren't they?
Artificial, yes. So we've got a real problem with the diagnosis of this, and yet the outcomes of a diagnosis, or the outcomes of, I keep using the word diagnosis, I shouldn't, because it isn't. This isn't an illness. If it's an illness, who's got it? Is it the child? Is it the parent? And if the illness is being anxious, that doesn't seem to me to be something that you diagnose as a medical condition. So we've got real problems with it. And then you start picking up lots of things which are about opinion. So the parents' insistence on continued investigation, instead of focusing on symptom alleviation. Well, that's if, like we heard from Ellie, there's a misdiagnosis, then they're going to continue. You're going to continue insisting on more investigations because the answers haven't been found. Inappropriately seeking multiple medical opinions. Well, if Ellie hadn't done that, she wouldn't have got the treatment that her child needed. And that's the case for many other parents that I've seen who've been accused of this. It's actually delayed the right sort of treatment being taken. Not able to accept reassurance or recommended management. Again, Ellie's given us such an eloquent description of when that is so wrong. And behind all this is the issue of diagnosis in medicine and the accuracy of diagnoses. There are many, many rare diseases or difficult to diagnose diseases, which maybe apply to only small numbers of people. But when you tot up the numbers of different things that could lead to one of these diagnoses, I think the World Health Organization estimated that I think it was 1 in 8 of all people would at some point be subject of a rare condition. Now, what we've got here is a real problem because you've got conditions that are hard to diagnose, that can be misdiagnosed, and that then are interpreted as a parent lying or exaggerating and harming their child. Now, I know that there's probably a very, very small number of cases where there is serious harm done, and there is this whole business of somebody actually changing the results of things, or poisoning their child, or suffocating the child. It's rare. I tried to look up how many children had died of these sorts of things, because again, the research says a high proportion of children where they're looking at FII will die. When I looked through the whole of the database for the last 8 years of serious case reviews, there were only 2 cases of children who died where FII was mentioned, and neither of them had died from FII. One was a suicide, and one was an older teenage girl who had a heart failure. None of these were fitted what used to be called Munchausen, and which had all the problems that Munchausen's had. And now what we've got is a set of criteria that are going to lead to many, many more people being drawn into that net inappropriately and at great harm to them.
And destroying families, as we've seen in Ellie's situation. And there could be a whole range of reasons why a parent might be apprehensive and trying to find as many answers as they can about presentations that they're exhibiting.
Your child is ill, unwell, chronically. You are their voice, and it is incumbent on you to help someone figure it out. You go to the doctor for help. To have that turned on you, also that I think I must comment about invisible conditions and hidden illness and chronic illness and our understanding and acceptance around that, because I think this is hugely part of that there is a lack of acceptance that unless you can see the condition or unless the lab tests come back positive, and let's be clear on lab tests, the lab tests on the narrow criteria that the doctor asks for them to look at. So often there's an awful lot that is overlooked. So I think that the attitudes, the hubris, the approach towards ethical humanitarian care is lost, absolutely lost, and it's a travesty and devastating.
Andy, does it have to start with the motivation of the parent? I mean, does one have to establish that it somehow it's a desire on the parent's part to fulfill their own sort of unmet emotional needs? Is that
this is one of the myths of what's been presented as FII. That was originally something which came up in Munchausen syndrome by proxy. The problem with the new definition is that it's so broad and it contains so many different things which are actually not the same as each other. You know, being over anxious and asking for extra help is not the same as smothering a child to death. These things are entirely different.
It's like the other thing from what we heard from Fiona a moment ago was that there has to be some establishment of abuse or harm. I mean, who decides what is the detriment that the child might have suffered as a result of that? Is there anything in the guidance that helps?
I find that there's not a lot in the guidance that helps, because so much of it is this broad overview and that is falsely indicating what's going on. Obviously, in terms of going before a court, you've got to have some form of significant harm. Somebody has to make a judgment on that. The formal process for that should be that there's that a social worker does an assessment under Section 47 of the 89 Act. So there has to be that sort of assessment. Now, the real problem with this is about medical power. The issue here is that at the start of all this, you've got the problem of medical power between the parents and the medics who are saying, this isn't how we see it, and you've got to conform to what we say. And then at the element of it, when it comes before the child protection end of the spectrum, you've got social workers having to stand up to medical power themselves, because they will be presented, the way these procedures go, with a situation where a lot has already been done and a conclusion has been reached.
I mean, I suppose there's one thing about whether you meet the threshold of significant harm to warrant sort of formal legal proceedings. But as we've heard in Ellie's case, it doesn't have to go that far before it devastates the family. I mean, exactly. The alerting signs are, you know, from what you were mentioning, it causes me really some grave concerns. I mean, particularly about whether or not this is in many ways discriminating very, very badly against groups of parents who may themselves have a disability. And I'd like to bring in Judy to discuss that. I mean, Judy, is that a concern that you have in relation to these alert signs and the discrimination that might often follow as a result?
Absolutely, it's a big issue. I mean, I've been involved now for 20 years in assessment and diagnosis of autism in particular, and I totally agree with what Fiona's saying about yes, paediatricians and GPs are very, very skilled, and they are, skilled medical professionals. However, they don't necessarily have the specialist knowledge in every single condition. And a lot of the perplexing presentation side of it is around the fact that it's not perceived as being a neurodevelopmental difficulty. It's not seen as autism. And things like PDA, the pathological demand avoidant kind of presentation, where children can present in very dysregulated and upset kind of ways, it's interpreted in a way, in a framework that they understand, and not necessarily in the way that those people who see it every day and work with it every day might interpret it. When you're saying about parents, yeah, I mean, obviously there are parents out there who have neurodevelopmental difficulties themselves and who may be autistic. And a lot of the time they have been misdiagnosed as having personality disorders. And as Andy points out, one of the red flag things is about this perception about personality disorders and people doing things for their own kind of emotional and psychological needs. And, these parents with autism do not have personality disorders, they have autism. And so many of them will report the horrendous experiences, the anxiety that they experience about their interactions with professionals and how those interactions might be interpreted. And it can be very difficult, because the more anxious they become, the more challenging they can be perceived to be by other professionals, because they may be stuck on a particular point. They may really need to get their point across. And there is no evidence out there to suggest that parents with autism are any worse at parenting their children than any other parent. Again, it's a misconception. And the guidance talks about these parents, and it's in a very kind of derogatory, judgmental kind of way, with, like Andy's saying, no real evidence to support that these parents, as they are called, are any different to other parents.
It's terrifying from that 2016 study, which I mentioned when I introduced Fiona.
Yeah.
The number of parents who have faced accusations and who've been investigated by social services when they are autistic themselves. It's just terrifying, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And when you talk about harm to the child, it talks about the child needing to have education and a social life and all those kind of things that you would expect that they actually should want. But, maybe sometimes the education that they're being offered is not right for them. And when you're talking in terms of harm, actually the harm of putting the child into that situation where they are traumatized on a daily basis, the harm that can result from that is actually a lot worse than the fact that the parent has taken them out of school or has taken them for medical appointments. Because I've worked in inpatient services and I've seen the results of these young people having complete breakdowns and ending up in a far worse situation than they would have been had their parents been believed and had they been offered the appropriate education and support packages.
I mean, I suppose people with autism will have a particular interest in getting to the bottom, and they almost, for some people, it might be almost an obsession to get to the bottom of what is causing the child to be so unwell in these given situations, and yet that obsession, based on the interpretation and the information we've been given by everyone today, is more likely than not to lead to this kind of allegation.
Yeah, actually one person's obsession is another person's special interest, and actually a lot of these parents can be exceptionally good at their research. They're very thorough and they have really done their homework. So again, we're even using the word obsession has a slightly negative connotation to it, and there are judgments around that. They're often very, very good, and they know what they know.
Absolutely, yeah. And I suppose from the definition, I was looking at the guidance earlier, and there's mention made of exaggeration of conditions, I suppose, and then and people can be accused of over-exaggerating the symptom. I mean, in what way does exaggeration actually equate to fabrication?
Well, again, it's not exaggeration. I think some of that comes about because these behaviours are simply not seen in school. And just because a child isn't necessarily throwing the chairs around the room, as Ellie said, sometimes they simply just merge into the background, and it builds up all day. And then they go home, and the parents, when they're in their safe place, the child will explode and will display quite challenging and difficult behaviour. So the parent is not exaggerating what they're seeing. They're reporting their reality. And actually, when you talk on a daily basis to parents, they're often broken and they are desperate for somebody to listen to them and offer them some kind of support. So, they're not exaggerating, they're reporting their reality.
I think we have to be really brave that for some children, the educational environments as they are extremely difficult and they aren't able to get out of that cycle. We also need to accept that we want parents to seek help when they need it. We actually rely on them to do so. And what we are doing with all of this guidance, these attitudes and perceptions, is we are shoving parents under buses on a daily basis. We're traumatizing both the parents and the children, and we are driving parents' fears underground because they're going to be too afraid to seek support.
Yeah. And believe me, when you have a genuine parent sitting in your clinic room, and you can see the pain. Why would anyone want to make that up? Why would anyone want to exaggerate that? These parents are broken.